The file in front of you was never officially closed. The investigators moved on. The witnesses stopped talking. The leads ran dry, but the case never closed. What you are about to hear has been documented. The timeline, the evidence, the questions that were never answered. Welcome to case number unknown. Let's open the file. In February 1994, a balding, unremarkable man in a rumpled suit drove his red Jaguar XJ6 out of his driveway in Arlington, Virginia. He was heading to work, just as he had every morning for 31 years. But this morning was different. Before he could reach CIA headquarters in Langley, FBI agents swarmed his vehicle, yanked him from the driver's seat, and placed him in handcuffs. His name was Aldrich Ames, and for 9 years, he had been the most damaging mole in the history of American intelligence. To understand how one man brought the Central Intelligence Agency to its knees, we have to go back decades, to a time when the Cold War was at its most dangerous, and the CIA and KGB were locked in a shadow war that would determine the fate of the world. Aldrich Ames was born on June 26, 1941, in River Falls, Wisconsin. His father, Carlton Ames, was a CIA officer who worked undercover in Burma during the 1950s. The younger Ames grew up steeped in the culture of espionage. It was in his blood, quite literally. In 1962, at just 21 years old, Aldrich joined the CIA as a clerk typist while attending George Washington University. By 1969, he had risen to become a case officer in the Directorate of Operations, the clandestine arm of the agency responsible for recruiting and handling foreign spies. His early career was competent but unremarkable. He served overseas in Ankara, Turkey, and later in Mexico City, where he was tasked with recruiting Soviet intelligence officers. Colleagues described him as intelligent but sloppy, a heavy drinker who sometimes fell asleep at his desk. His first marriage fell apart. His performance reviews were mediocre at best, and yet the CIA kept promoting him. By 1983, Aldrich Ames was assigned to the Soviet and East European Division at CIA headquarters, one of the most sensitive positions in the entire intelligence community. He had access to the identities of virtually every CIA asset operating inside the Soviet Union. He knew who the moles were. He knew their real names. He knew where they lived. It was a staggering amount of trust placed in a man who was quietly drowning in debt. In 1985, Ames was going through a costly divorce from his first wife, Nancy Segebarth. He had begun a relationship with Maria del Rosario Casas Dupai, a Colombian woman he had met while stationed in Mexico City. Rosario, as she was known, had expensive tastes. Ames wanted to impress her. He wanted a lifestyle that a mid-level CIA salary of roughly $45,000 a year simply could not support. And so, on April 16, 1985, Aldrich Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and offered to sell the names of CIA agents working inside the Soviet Union. He asked for $50,000. The KGB could hardly believe their luck. Here was a senior CIA officer with access to the crown jewels of American intelligence, practically walking through their front door. They paid him immediately, and then they waited to see what he would deliver. What he delivered was catastrophic. On June 13, 1985, Ames handed over a shopping bag filled with classified documents to his Soviet handler, Sergei Chuvakhin. In that bag were the names of more than 10 CIA and FBI sources inside the Soviet government. It was the single largest compromise of intelligence assets in American history. Ames later described that moment as crossing a line from which there was no return. He said he felt a kind of relief, as though a tremendous burden had been lifted. The consequences were devastating and swift. Within months, the CIA's most valuable Soviet agents began to disappear. Dmitry Polyakov, a Soviet general who had spied for the United States for nearly 20 years, one of the most important assets in American intelligence history, was arrested, interrogated, and executed. Adolf Talkeshev, a Soviet defense researcher who had provided invaluable intelligence on radar and weapons systems, was arrested and shot. Valery Martinov and Sergei Motorin, both KGB officers who had been recruited by the FBI, were called back to Moscow under false pretenses and executed. In all, at least 10 agents identified by Ames were killed by the Soviet government. Others were imprisoned. Entire intelligence networks, built over decades of painstaking work, were rolled up and destroyed. Back in Langley, panic was setting in. The CIA knew something was terribly wrong. Assets were being compromised at an alarming rate. There had to be a leak. But where? The agency launched an internal investigation in 1986, codenamed the Special Task Force, to determine the source of the losses. They considered dozens of possibilities. Perhaps the Soviets had broken American codes. Perhaps there was a technical breach. The one possibility no one wanted to confront was the most obvious one, that someone inside the CIA itself was a traitor. Meanwhile, Aldrich Ames was living a double life in plain sight. After marrying Rosario in 1985, he began spending lavishly. He paid $540,000 in cash for a new home in Arlington. He drove the Jaguar. He wore expensive Italian suits. He and Rosario ran up credit card bills that dwarfed his government salary. Over the course of his espionage career, Ames would receive approximately $2.7 million from the KGB, with another $2 million promised for future deliveries. When colleagues noticed his sudden wealth, Ames offered a simple explanation. His wife's family in Colombia was wealthy, he said. It was an inheritance. No one at the CIA bothered to verify this claim for years. The investigation dragged on through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s. A joint CIA-FBI team known as the Ames Mole Hunt was formally established in 1991. Investigators began painstakingly cross-referencing who had access to the compromised cases. They examined financial records. They tracked travel patterns. Slowly, agonizingly, the circle of suspects narrowed. Ames had been sloppy in many ways. He had deposited large cash sums into bank accounts. His financial disclosures to the CIA were riddled with inconsistencies. He had been seen meeting with Soviet officials outside of his official duties. In 1993, the FBI took over the investigation and began intensive surveillance of Ames. They tapped his phone. They searched his trash. They placed a tracking device on his Jaguar. And in October 1993, agents secretly entered his home and found a treasure trove of evidence on his personal computer, including notes to his Soviet handlers, details about dead drops, and classified documents he had no authorization to possess. The evidence was overwhelming. On February 21, 1994, the FBI arrested Aldrich Ames and his wife Rosario as they left their Arlington home. He was charged with espionage and conspiracy to commit espionage. Rosario was charged with conspiracy to commit espionage and tax evasion. The arrest sent shockwaves through the intelligence community and made headlines around the world. The director of the CIA at the time, James Woolsey, would later resign in part because of the scandal. The agency was humiliated. How had a man with a known drinking problem, mediocre performance reviews, and an inexplicable fortune been allowed to operate undetected for 9 years in one of the most sensitive positions in American intelligence? Ames cooperated with investigators after his arrest, in part to secure a lighter sentence for Rosario. He was debriefed extensively, providing details about his methods, his contacts, and the full scope of his betrayal. In April 1994, he pleaded guilty to espionage and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rosario Ames pleaded guilty to conspiracy and tax charges and was sentenced to 63 months in federal prison. She was released in 1999 and deported to Colombia. The damage assessment that followed Ames's arrest was staggering. He had compromised more than 100 intelligence operations. He had revealed the identities of at least 30 CIA agents, at least 10 of whom were executed. He had provided the KGB with details about American intelligence methods, communication systems, and strategic priorities. Senior intelligence officials called it the worst breach in CIA history until Robert Hanssen, an FBI agent who had also been spying for Russia, was arrested in 2001. The Ames case forced a reckoning within the American intelligence community. The CIA implemented sweeping reforms, including mandatory polygraph examinations, stricter financial disclosure requirements, and improved counterintelligence procedures. Congress held hearings, blue-ribbon panels issued recommendations. The agency that prided itself on being the world's premier intelligence service had to confront an uncomfortable truth. Its greatest vulnerability was not a foreign adversary's technology or tactics. It was its own people. Today, Aldrich Ames is 73 years old, serving his life sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Terre Haute, Indiana. He will never be released. He has given interviews from prison, speaking with a chilling detachment about the lives he destroyed. He has expressed no remorse for the agents who were executed because of his betrayal. He has said only that he did what he felt he had to do. But here is the question that still haunts the intelligence community 3 decades later. If Aldrich Ames could operate undetected for 9 years inside the CIA, with all of his red flags in plain view, his drinking, his debt, his sudden wealth, his sloppy tradecraft, then how many others might still be hiding in the shadows, betraying secrets that we don't even know are missing? The investigation is ongoing. If you have a case you think deserves a file, leave it in the comments. New files open every week. Subscribe, because the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how long it takes.